The town of Hradec, tucked deep in the rolling hills of Eastern Europe, looked peaceful on the surface in the spring of 1952. Its cobblestone streets wound between modest houses, their red-tiled roofs glistening in the morning light, and the sound of a distant church bell rolled through the valley. But beneath its quiet charm lay something the townsfolk refused to talk about aloud: the old railway tunnel. It had been built before the First World War, a triumph of engineering at the time, carved straight through the mountain to connect Hradec to the larger cities beyond. Trains had thundered through its stone maw for decades until the war ended and the line was officially closed. The authorities claimed it was due to structural instability, rockfalls, collapsed supports. But everyone in town knew there was another reason, though they preferred to whisper it only after a few too many drinks. Children dared one another to go near the blackened entrance, but no one ever stayed long. Travelers passing through sometimes tried to take a shortcut by walking through it, but most never came out the other side. People spoke of strange echoes, voices that weren't their own, and lights flickering deep in the darkness where no lantern could shine. The tunnel earned a name: the Mouth of Silence. For years the townsfolk avoided it, letting ivy and weeds grow thick over the stone arch. But in 1952, the Ministry of Transport sent word that the tunnel was to be sealed permanently. A work crew would arrive, clear the entrance, and brick it over. To the government it was just an abandoned hazard. To the locals, it was like trying to put a bandage over a wound that still festered. The men chosen for the job were all from Hradec, for no outsiders wanted to linger in that valley. Among them was Joseph Merrick, a young father of two, who'd signed on for the extra pay. He had grown up hearing the stories but dismissed them as superstitious rambling from drunks and widows. "A tunnel's a tunnel," he told his wife Anna when she begged him not to go. "It's stone and earth. Nothing more." The first morning they gathered at the entrance, the mist hung low over the hills, shrouding the archway in a pale veil. Joseph and the others hacked away at the tangle of ivy, their pickaxes clanging against the old stones. The darkness beyond yawned at them, cool air flowing from within like the exhale of some hidden beast. "Feels colder inside than out here," muttered Pavel, the oldest of the crew, rubbing his arms. "That's how it always is in caves," Joseph replied, though he noticed the way his breath fogged as if it were the dead of winter. They set up lanterns and prepared to measure how far inside the collapse stretched. But the deeper they went, the less natural it felt. The air pressed on their ears as if they were descending into water. Their lamps hissed and sputtered, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the damp stone walls. And then came the sound. At first it was just a faint trickle, like water dripping far away. Then it changed, the drip became a whisper. Not one voice, but many, all murmuring at once, too low to understand. The men froze. Joseph strained his ears and swore he heard his own name among them, carried in the echo of the stone. "Did you hear that?" whispered Pavel. "It's just wind," Joseph said too quickly. But even as he said it, he knew there was no breeze. They pressed on another 20 meters before their lantern light caught something strange. The stone walls were carved with marks, deep scratches, dozens of them, gouged into the rock by desperate hands. The claw marks were uneven, frantic, some smeared with what looked like ancient, rust-colored stains. The men went silent. Nobody made a joke now. One of them, Karel, bent down and lifted something half buried in the gravel. It was a shoe. A child's shoe, cracked with age, its leather stiff. Beside it lay a small bone no longer than a finger. Joseph's throat tightened. He wanted to drop everything and run, but something about the tunnel's darkness held him in place, as though the shadows leaned forward, watching. "Let's get out," said Pavel hoarsely. "This isn't right." But when they turned to leave, their lanterns flickered and dimmed. The whispering grew louder, swirling in every direction. And for a heartbeat, Joseph thought he saw a pale figure standing deeper in the tunnel, watching them, unmoving, its eyes reflecting the lantern glow like two shards of glass. By the time they stumbled out into the gray daylight, they were drenched in sweat despite the cold. No one spoke. No one laughed. And as Joseph glanced back over his shoulder at the arch of the tunnel, he could swear he saw that same pale figure standing just inside the darkness, as if it hadn't followed them out because it didn't need to. It knew they would return tomorrow. Joseph hardly slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whispers echoing in his skull, as though the tunnel had followed him into his home. He would wake to the creak of the old house and glance toward the bedroom door, convinced someone stood just outside. His wife stirred beside him, mumbling in her sleep, and each sound made his skin crawl. By morning, dark circles clung to his eyes, but he still rose before dawn. Men like him didn't refuse government work, especially not when pay was involved. If he walked away, there'd be whispers through town, the kind of whispers that spread faster than fire. Coward, weak, cursed. The crew gathered again at the tunnel's mouth, tools slung over shoulders, the atmosphere much different than the day before. No one made jokes this time. No one tried to brush off the fear. Pavel crossed himself before stepping in, and even Karel, who was usually all bravado, clutched a flask at his side and took a swig before the lanterns were lit. The air inside was heavier than the day before, pressing against their lungs. The dampness clung to their skin, thick as oil, and the scratching marks on the walls seemed to multiply in the flickering light, like new ones had appeared overnight. "We just go as far as needed, clear the debris and measure for bricking," Joseph said firmly. He needed to sound steady for his own sake if nothing else. But 20 meters in, Pavel suddenly stopped. His lamp wavered, trembling in his hand. "Do you hear it again?" he asked. They all froze. The whispers had returned, only louder this time, more urgent. Joseph strained to listen. Beneath the murmurs he heard something else, a scraping sound like nails dragging across stone. And then a voice cut through the noise, clear, sharp, and close. "Joseph?" He spun around, his lantern jerking wildly. The others stared at him in horror, for none of them had spoken. The scrape grew louder, echoing from deeper inside the tunnel. Against every instinct they pressed forward. And soon their light illuminated something new. A wooden door. It looked impossibly old, set into the side wall of the tunnel. The boards were splintered, the iron hinges rusted to near dust, but it was still sealed shut with a heavy chain. No one had ever mentioned a room built inside the railway tunnel. No plans, no records. "What the hell is this?" whispered Karel, stepping forward. Joseph felt his chest tighten. The door radiated a strange cold, and the whispers seemed to coil around it, rising and falling like a chorus. "Leave it," Pavel hissed. "We weren't told about this. We don't touch it." But Karel, half drunk and desperate to prove his courage, raised his pickaxe and swung. The wood splintered under the blow. The whispering stopped, dead silent, as if the tunnel itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. Joseph's skin prickled with ice. "Stop. Don't." Too late. Karel swung again and the chain snapped. The door groaned open, its hinges screaming. A rush of air spilled out, colder than any winter wind, carrying with it the stench of rot. Their lanterns nearly guttered out, and Joseph staggered back, gagging. The light revealed a narrow chamber beyond, carved crudely into the rock. Its floor was littered with bones. Not animal bones. Human bones. Dozens of them, tangled together in heaps, their skulls cracked, ribs splintered. And above them, smeared across the stone walls in dried, flaking strokes, were words scrawled in some old dialect. Joseph didn't recognize them fully, but he caught fragments: feed, silence, debt. Pavel dropped his lantern, the glass shattering. The sound echoed unnaturally loud. In the sudden flicker of shadows, Joseph swore he saw something shift in the back of the chamber. A figure slumped against the wall. At first he thought it was just another skeleton, but then it moved. The pale figure raised its head. Its eyes reflected the lamplight like a predator's. Its lips, cracked and bloodless, curled into something between a smile and a snarl. And then the whispers came back, louder than ever, not drifting but roaring, and Joseph realized with sick horror that they weren't coming from the walls. They were pouring from the figure itself. He stumbled backward, clutching at his chest. The other men screamed. The lanterns shook. And the tunnel, for the first time in decades, was alive again. Joseph's legs nearly gave way as he tried to drag himself backward, but the narrow tunnel made every movement clumsy, desperate. Karel was the first to scream, a raw, broken sound that didn't fit a man of his size. His lantern swung wildly, shadows leaping over the chamber walls. The figure was rising. Not with the clumsy stiffness of a corpse, but with the slow, deliberate grace of something that had been waiting too long. Its skin was gray, stretched thin, almost translucent over the bones beneath. Its mouth never closed, lips twitching as whispers spilled from it in endless streams. "Shut it, shut the door." Joseph barked, but his own voice cracked with fear. Karel stumbled forward, slamming the wood with his shoulder, but the rotten boards splintered under his weight. The figure's head tilted, a rattling sound spilling from its throat, laughter or breathing Joseph couldn't tell. Pavel dropped to his knees, muttering prayers, but even he couldn't drown out the voices. They weren't whispers anymore. They were words, clear and commanding, spoken in Czech and yet older than it. "Stay." Joseph froze. It wasn't just in his ears, it was in his skull, reverberating behind his eyes. The others heard it too. Karel, his face pale and slick with sweat, pressed his hands against his ears as though he could block it out. Suddenly the figure moved. It lurched forward, not with steps, but with a jerk, like the air itself shoved it. Its body blurred in the lantern light, and in that instant Joseph realized, it wasn't moving normally. It was folding, slipping between the spaces of the dark. One moment near the chamber wall, the next just a few feet away with no steps between. Joseph stumbled back, his shoulders slamming against the stone. His lamp nearly toppled, but he caught it in trembling hands. Out! Out now, he shouted. They bolted. Their boots pounded against the wet stone as they tore back through the tunnel. The walls seemed to close in, every turn familiar yet somehow distorted. The flicker of the lamps barely cut the suffocating dark. Behind them, the whispers surged like a storm, not one voice now but dozens, hundreds, all snarling, pleading, laughing at once. Joseph didn't dare look back. But Carell did. His scream tore through the tunnel, high-pitched and terrified. Joseph glanced over his shoulder just long enough to see the figure mere paces behind Carell, its arms stretched unnaturally long, fingers like hooks reaching for him. Carell's lantern shattered as he fell. In the split-second glow before darkness swallowed him, Joseph saw the thing seize him. Saw Carell's body jerk upward, his head twisting at an angle no human neck could bear. Then the light was gone. Pavel shoved Joseph forward. Don't look. Run. They ran until Joseph's chest burned, until the tunnel seemed endless. He prayed for the mouth of the tunnel, for even a sliver of daylight, but every turn looked the same. Finally, a faint gray glow appeared ahead. Salvation. They sprinted toward it, tripping over rocks and rails, lungs heaving. Joseph burst out first, stumbling into the daylight, his body collapsing against the damp grass outside. Pavel followed, gasping, collapsing beside him. For a moment, silence. Only the sound of their ragged breathing, the rustle of trees. The world felt alive again, the sun too bright, the air too thin. Joseph turned back toward the tunnel. The entrance yawned black, empty, silent. No sign of Carell. And then the whispers came again, faint but unmistakable, carrying out into the daylight. Pavel clutched Joseph's arm. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. We have to seal it? No. Before it comes out. Joseph stared into the tunnel, his heart hammering. He knew Pavel was right. But something inside him twisted, a darker thought clawing at his mind. What if it already followed us out? Joseph and Pavel staggered away from the tunnel mouth, their legs trembling with every step. The forest around them, once a place of childhood hunts and campfires, now seemed too still. Not a bird sang. The wind didn't stir. The world held its breath. Pavel bent forward, vomiting into the grass, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep his balance. When he lifted his head, there were tears in his eyes. Carell, his voice cracked. We can't leave him there. Joseph clenched his fists, trying to push down the rising guilt that gnawed at his chest. He wanted to shout, Carell is dead. But the words caught in his throat. Because a darker thought hovered there. Maybe Carell wasn't dead at all. Maybe he was worse than dead. Instead, Joseph growled, if we go back we die too. Pavel wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. He nodded faintly, though his eyes burned with shame. Then we seal it. They scoured the area for anything they could use, fallen branches, rocks, even the rusted metal sheets from an old cart nearby. Joseph's hands bled as he dragged stones to the entrance, stacking them clumsily against the yawning black. Every time he glanced toward the tunnel, he expected to see a pale arm stretch out, a body twist its way into daylight. But the entrance remained still, like a predator waiting in tall grass. By dusk they had barricaded it as best they could. The pile looked pitiful, flimsy against whatever they had awoken, but the effort left them too weak to think. Joseph sank against a tree, panting. Pavel crouched nearby, his head in his hands. The forest darkened quickly. Shadows pooled, stretching long and deep, until the world was only shapes and whispers of movement. Joseph lifted his head at the sound. At first he thought it was wind, a low moan passing through the branches. But as the sound grew he recognized it, voices. Not one but many. They weren't coming from the tunnel anymore. They were coming from all around them. Pavel stood abruptly, clutching the handle of his broken lantern like a weapon. His face was pale, his lips trembling. It's out here. Joseph wanted to deny it, but the evidence pressed in on them. The voices wove through the trees, circling, laughing, chanting words too old to understand. The air grew heavy, thick, as though the night itself pressed closer. And then they saw him. Not the gray figure from before, but Carell. Or something that looked like him. He stepped between the trees, his clothes torn, his face blank. His head hung loosely to the side, twisted at the angle Joseph had seen in that flash of lantern light. Yet he walked as though it didn't matter, each step deliberate, too steady for a broken man. God, Pavel whispered. Karel? Joseph rose to his feet, backing away. That's not him. Carol's mouth opened. At first no sound came. Then, slowly, horribly, the voices began to pour out of him. Not his voice, but the same whispers from the tunnel, hundreds of them spilling from his throat, his eyes vacant, unblinking. Joseph grabbed Pavel's arm. Run. They tore through the forest, branches slashing at their faces, lungs screaming for air. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, chasing. They dared not look back, though the sound of footsteps followed, not running but gliding, steady, relentless. Finally, the outline of the village appeared through the trees. Lanterns flickered in windows, smoke curled from chimneys. Salvation. They stumbled into the first street, collapsing against the cobblestones. A woman carrying water screamed, dropping her bucket at the sight of them, bloodied, wild-eyed, gasping like hunted animals. People gathered quickly, voices rising, questions hurled at them. Joseph tried to explain, tried to speak, but the words tangled in his mouth. Pavel only shook his head, mumbling prayers, staring back toward the tree line. Because he could hear it still. The whispers had followed them into the village. The villagers pressed in around Joseph and Pavel, their voices sharp with suspicion and fear. These were men they'd known since childhood, yet tonight they looked like strangers, pale, hollow-eyed, trembling as though they'd fled the devil himself. What happened? One man demanded. What's in the forest? Joseph tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick, his words meaningless. There's something in the old shaft, Karel? At the mention of Carol's name, silence fell. The villagers exchanged looks, their faces grim. Everyone knew the mine was cursed. Parents warned their children to stay away. Hunters crossed themselves when passing its edge. But it had always been a superstition, a story. Until now. Behind them, from the dark edge of the forest, came a sound. It was faint but unmistakable, the murmur of many voices whispering as one. The villagers froze. Heads turned. Do you hear that? A woman whispered. A child began to cry. The voices grew louder, no longer content to remain on the edges of the night. They spilled into the village like smoke through cracks in a door. Windows rattled. Dogs howled, then fell silent. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the sound. Joseph felt his knees weaken. It was happening again. The voices weren't bound to the mine. They were free. Then the church bell rang. Father Lucas, the parish priest, had seen the commotion. He strode into the square, his cassock trailing in the dust, a brass crucifix gleaming in his hand. His face was stern, but his eyes flickered with unease. What is this? He demanded. The whispers faltered for a moment, as though recognizing the defiance in his voice. The crowd pressed closer to him, as if the man's faith alone could shield them. Joseph staggered forward. Father. Karel, it's not him anymore. The mine, it's full of something old. But Joseph's words were drowned out. From the shadows of the trees, Karel stepped into the lantern light. His head was still bent at that unnatural angle, his skin gray and stretched. His eyes reflected no spark of life. The villagers gasped. Someone shouted his name as if hoping he might come to his senses. Karel opened his mouth. The whispers burst out, louder than ever, so loud that villagers clutched their ears, crying out in pain. It was not one voice but hundreds, each overlapping, each carrying ancient fury. The cobblestones trembled. The church bell groaned as though struck by invisible hands. Father Lucas raised his crucifix, shouting prayers into the storm of voices. For a moment it seemed to work. The whispers thinned, faltered. The figure of Karel twitched as though struggling against unseen chains. But then something darker pushed through. The whispers became screams. The priest staggered backward, blood trickling from his ears. His crucifix slipped from his hand, clattering against the stones. Panic erupted. The villagers scattered, rushing for their homes, dragging children by the arms. Windows slammed shut. Bolts slid into place. But the voices did not stop. They poured down the narrow streets, echoing through every alley and doorway. Joseph grabbed Pavel's arm. We have to leave, now. Before it takes the whole village. But Pavel stood frozen, staring at Karel. His lips moved soundlessly. He whispered his brother's name again and again, as if clinging to the hope that some part of him still lived inside that husk. Then Karel lifted his hand, or rather, the thing wearing Karel did. His fingers curled and Pavel's body stiffened. His eyes widened in shock as invisible strings pulled him forward, step by step, toward his dead brother. Joseph shouted, lunging for him, but the moment his fingers touched Pavel's arm, a shock of cold shot through his body. He felt the voices inside his own skull now, writhing like worms, whispering his name. He let go, stumbling back. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath ragged. And then, to his horror, he realized. The voices weren't just around them anymore. They were inside the villagers too. From every window he heard them echo. From behind bolted doors people began to scream. One by one the cries turned to laughter, low, guttural, alien. The village was no longer theirs. The night burned itself into memory like a brand, and Joseph knew he would never escape it. The village was alive with screams. Windows glowed with firelight, though no one had set torches. The air was thick with a heat that should not have existed, considering the cold mountain wind. The whispers had become a choir of madness, echoing from every stone wall, every roof beam, every crack in the earth. Joseph staggered through the square, clutching his ears, but it did no good. The voices weren't around him anymore. They were inside him, dragging across his mind like nails. He could barely think, barely breathe. But one thought pushed through: he had to reach the church. The bell still swung above the steeple, though no one had rung it since Father Lucas fell. Something in Joseph's gut told him it mattered. That if anything could hold back the storm, it was there. He ran, stumbling past shadows that wore familiar faces twisted into mockery. He saw old neighbors peering from doorways, their mouths stretched into two wide grins. Children giggled in tones that weren't theirs, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He burst into the church. The doors slammed shut behind him as if the building itself were trying to shield him. The air inside was cooler still. The whispers dimmed, though they pressed hard against the walls, like a tide straining against a dam. On the altar, Father Lucas lay crumpled, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His ears bled, his hands trembling as he tried to lift the crucifix he had dropped. "Father," Joseph gasped, rushing to him. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" The priest's lips trembled. He could barely form the words. The bell, it was blessed, it must ring, drive them back. Joseph turned toward the stairs leading to the belfry. They loomed high and dark, coiling upward into shadow. He hesitated for only a moment before gripping the railing and climbing. Each step was heavier than the last. The whispers pressed harder, trying to force him back. He heard his mother's voice, though she'd been dead for years. He heard Pavel calling for him, begging him to stop. He heard Carol's broken laughter, echoing like iron on stone. At the top he emerged into the belfry. The great iron bell hung before him, swaying slightly as though already in motion. The rope dangled, worn and frayed. Joseph grasped it. The moment he pulled, a scream tore through his head. His vision blurred. His hands slipped with sweat. But the bell groaned and swung, striking once, twice. Its deep toll rolled across the valley, a sound older than the village itself, older than the mine. For an instant, silence. Then chaos. The whispers shrieked in unison, writhing like smoke caught in a storm. Shadows peeled away from the walls of the church, clawing at the windows. Outside, he heard the villagers screaming again, this time not in laughter, but in agony. Something was being torn free. Joseph pulled again, though his arms felt like lead. The bell thundered once more. With each toll, the darkness thinned, the voices faltered. For the first time since that night began, he felt hope. Then the rope snapped. Joseph fell backward, crashing against the wooden boards. His breath tore from his lungs. Above him, the bell hung still, its voice silenced. And the whispers surged back. Through the shattered windows of the church, he saw them gather, shapes without faces, crawling, twisting, forming a tide that poured toward the building. In the front of the horde, leading them, was Karel. His body jerked like a puppet, his eyes glowing with something that was not human. Beside him walked Pavel, his expression slack, his movements unnatural. Joseph's heart broke. Both of them, gone. He forced himself up, clutching the priest's fallen crucifix. His legs shook. His body screamed for rest. But he stood in the aisle of the church as the doors began to splinter, shadows pouring through the cracks. He raised the crucifix. His voice, hoarse and broken, shouted into the storm, "You will not have me." The last thing Joseph saw before the doors gave way was Father Lucas, dragging himself upright, lips moving in silent prayer. The church filled with darkness. When the morning came, travelers passing through the valley found the village silent. Houses stood with doors ajar, food left uneaten on tables, candles burned to stubs. There was no sign of struggle, no bodies, nothing at all. The church bell lay cracked on the ground, split in two as though struck by lightning. The village was abandoned forever. Locals stopped speaking of it. Maps quietly erased its name. But on certain nights, when the wind shifted just right, people swore they could hear a faint sound drifting down the valley. The toll of a bell. And underneath it, the whisper of many voices, waiting for someone to listen.